What kind of warrior tears out his own teeth with a stone before going into battle? Who drinks the blood of dead enemies mixed with hallucinogenic mushrooms to enter a trance? What kind of man offers his own wife to other warriors to rape, believing that this will bring victory in war? Imagine that you are in Scandinavia in the 9th century. The sun has just risen, and you hear bestial screams coming from the forest. They are not cries of pain. They are cries of ecstasy. Viking warriors are preparing for battle, and what they do in the moments before departing defies all human logic. They sold you the romantic image of the brave Viking, fearless navigator, honored warrior. They told you about Eric the Red, about the great voyages, about Nordic bravery. But they never told you the truth about the rituals that turned ordinary men into bloodthirsty monsters. The truth is that the Vikings were not merely warriors. They were members of a death cult so disturbing that their very Christian contemporaries preferred death to conversion. A cult where extreme violence was not a consequence of war, but the very path to reach the gods. We are speaking of men who literally drugged themselves with hallucinogenic substances extracted from poisonous mushrooms. Warriors who entered states of fury so intense that they bit their own shields until they bled. Men who believed that the more pain and terror they caused before battle, the greater their reward in Valhalla would be. You know the berserkers, those warriors who fought without armor. But what you do not know is how they prepared to enter that state of fury. It was a ritual that began 3 days before battle, involving extreme fasting, controlled self-mutilation, and sexual practices so brutal that they left permanent scars. They believed that Odin, the father of all gods, would only accept in Valhalla those who demonstrated total contempt for their own humanity. And to prove this, they developed rituals that transformed going to war into a religious ceremony of pure barbarity. Imagine waking up next to one of those warriors on the morning of an invasion. He is not anxious or afraid. He is euphoric. His eyes are dilated from the drug he consumed all night long. His body is covered in cuts he himself made, bleeding over runes carved into his own skin. And he is smiling. Not a human smile. A bestial smile. For centuries, Christian monks recorded Viking attacks with a specific word: nightmare. They did not use terms such as battle, war, or invasion. They used nightmare, because what they witnessed did not seem to have come from this world. The Vikings themselves had a word to describe those transformed warriors: Ulfrednar. Translating literally, it means those who wear wolf skin. But its true meaning is far more sinister. It means those who have abandoned the human form. And now you are going to discover exactly what they did to achieve that transformation. Rituals that involved not only the warriors, but their entire families. Practices that began in childhood and culminated in ceremonies so disturbing that some historians refuse to document them fully. What I will reveal to you in the coming minutes is not found in the history books you read at school. It is buried in medieval manuscripts, in survivors' accounts, in archaeological excavations that revealed physical evidence of those rituals. Because the truth about what the Vikings did before dying in battle is not just history. It is a plunge into the darkest side of human nature. To understand the origin of that barbarity, you need to know Egil Skallagrimsson, poet, warrior, and historically documented berserker, who lived in Iceland between 904 and 995. Egil was not only a common Viking. He was a direct descendant of a lineage of wolfmen, the most feared Ulfhednar in all of Scandinavia. The first time Egil killed a man, he was only 7 years old. It was not an accident. It was an initiation ritual. His own father forced him to strangle a slave during a religious ceremony dedicated to Odin, and when Egil finished, he licked the blood that ran across his own hands. That was the reality of Viking culture. Children were shaped from birth to become killing machines without remorse. But the process involved not only military training. It involved the systematic destruction of any trace of human empathy through specific rituals. At 12 years old, every future berserker underwent the Blot Mader, the sacrifice of man. It was not metaphorical. It was literal. The boy was forced to choose a war captive and kill him slowly, following precise instructions on how to prolong agony. The objective was to desensitize the child completely to the suffering of others. But that was only the beginning. The real preparation to become a Ulfhednar began in adolescence with the controlled consumption of Amanita muscaria, the red hallucinogenic mushroom that grows in Nordic forests. It was not a recreational drug. It was a sacred substance that, they said, allowed direct communication with Odin during the trance. Irish monks, who were the first documented victims of Viking raids, described warriors who lost all resemblance to men and became demonic beasts. What they witnessed was the combined effect of hallucinogens with years of extreme psychological conditioning. Egil, in his own poems preserved to this day, describes how he prepared for battles. 3 days. Before any combat, he began total fasting, consuming only water mixed with the blood of sacrificed animals. On the second day, he started consuming small doses of the mushrooms, gradually increasing the amount. On the third day, the ritual reached its climax. Egil isolated himself completely, naked, in a dark cabin, consuming massive doses of the hallucinogen while chanting enchantments dedicated to Odin. During these sessions, he reported visions in which the very god of the dead gave him specific instructions on how to kill his enemies. But the most disturbing aspect of those rituals was not the use of drugs. It was what happened when the hallucinogenic effect combined with controlled self-mutilation. The berserkers believed that shedding their own blood during the trance created a stronger spiritual connection with Odin. Egil had his entire body covered with ritual scars, not battle scars, scars that he inflicted on himself with a sacred blade during his hallucinogenic trances. Each scar represented a promise of violence that he would carry out in the next battle. Archaeological excavations at Viking sites confirm these accounts. Small, extremely sharp blades clearly unsuitable for combat, but perfect for precise cuts on the skin, have been found. Alongside those blades, remains of Amanita muscaria mushrooms and containers with human blood residues were discovered. Historians estimate that an experienced berserker like Egil consumed doses of hallucinogens that would kill any normal person, but years of controlled use created a tolerance that allowed him to function in extreme altered states of consciousness. And when those drugged, bleeding, psychologically conditioned warriors to maximum violence finally marched into battle, they were no longer men. They were something entirely different. But that was only the beginning. The rituals you have just been introduced to were only the individual preparation of the warriors. But on the eve of major battles, the Vikings carried out collective ceremonies that transformed entire tribes into genocide machines, ceremonies so brutal that even their own allies refused to participate. The most documented of those ceremonies was the husblot, the sacrifice of the household. It was not a symbolic ritual. It was a literal bloodbath that started with the sacrifice of all the village's animals and ended with something much worse. Imagine a clearing in the forest, surrounded by torches that create dancing shadows. On the trees, in the center, a gigantic bonfire where the bodies of the sacrificed animals are burned. The smell of charred flesh mixed with the sweet and nauseating aroma of hallucinogenic mushrooms that everyone is consuming. The warriors, already in a deep trance, begin the second phase of the ritual, the sacrifice of the slaves. But it was not a quick death. It was meticulously planned torture to extract the maximum suffering possible. They believed that the screams of agony fed Odin's thirst for blood directly. Arab chroniclers who witnessed those rituals during commercial expeditions described scenes that defy human imagination. Slaves being flayed alive while still conscious, guts being torn out and offered to the gods while the victims were still breathing. And that was not the worst. The final phase of the Husblot involved the warriors themselves and their families in practices that violated every known human taboo. Viking women, far from being passive victims, actively participated in those rituals with violence that shocked even the most experienced warriors. The vulvas, Odin's priestesses, led ritual orgies where sexual violence was considered a form of prayer. Group rapes were enacted as offerings to the gods, with the warriors' own wives offering themselves to be brutally assaulted by entire groups of drugged men. But the most disturbing aspect was the involvement of children. Boys from 10 years old were forced to participate in those orgies as a form of male initiation. Girls of the same age were ritually raped by groups of warriors as a way to awaken their warrior femininity. Archaeologists have found physical evidence of these rituals at Viking sites across Scandinavia. Children's skeletal remains with clear signs of sexual violence, buried along with amulets dedicated to Odin. Specialized torture tools, designed specifically to prolong the suffering of small victims. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, the Arab ambassador who witnessed a complete Husblot in 922, wrote that the men of the north transformed worship of their gods into a theater of horrors that would shame even demons themselves. His account is regarded as the most detailed document of those rituals that has survived to this day. He describes how, at the end of the ceremony, the warriors were so altered by the combination of drugs, violence, and sexual arousal that they did not even recognize their own families. Some tried to rape their own daughters. Others attacked their best friends with axes. And that was not the worst. Because what happened after the Husblot transformed those men, women, and children already brutalized into something that even other Vikings could not recognize as human. The final ritual, reserved only for the most important battles, involved a practice so abominable that even today, some historians refuse to document it completely. It was called barnblot, the sacrifice of children. And they were not slave children. They were the very sons and daughters of the warriors. And that was not the worst. What followed this revelation will forever change your understanding of the limits of human barbarity. The barnblot was the most sacred and secret ritual of all Viking culture. Reserved only for invasions that would determine the fate of entire kingdoms, it involved the sacrifice of the dearest children of each warrior family. Not slaves, not captives. The warrior's own children. The logic was simple and monstrous. Odin would grant total victory only to those who demonstrated willingness to sacrifice what they loved most. And for a Viking warrior, nothing was more precious than a male child trained from early childhood to continue the lineage of violence. Adam of Bremen, an 11th century German chronicler, managed to document a full barnblot through accounts of Christian survivors. The ritual began with the parents personally choosing which child would be sacrificed. It was not the weakest or sickest. It was always the most promising child, the one showing greatest warrior potential. The chosen child was then prepared for 7 days as if he were a deity. He received the best clothes, food, and treatment. He was adored by the entire tribe. On the 7th day, he discovered his fate, and the child's reaction upon learning that he would be sacrificed by his own father determined whether Odin would consider the ritual valid. If the child cried, begged, or tried to flee, the ritual was cancelled and deemed an offense to the gods. But if the child accepted his fate with bravery, showing readiness to die for his father's victory, the barnblot proceeded. And what followed defies all human comprehension. The child was brought to the center of the village, where a gigantic bonfire awaited. But it was not a quick death. The sacrifice lasted hours, with the father forced to carry out each stage of ritual torture personally. First, he cut each finger off one by one. Then he removed the eyes. Next, He opened the abdomen and removed the entrails while the child remained alive. And throughout the entire process, the child's mother was forced to sing hymns of praise to Odin, celebrating the sacrifice of her own son. If she showed any sign of sadness or hesitation, she too would be sacrificed. But the most abhorrent aspect of the barnblot was not the torture itself. It was what happened afterward. The other warriors, in deep hallucinogenic trance, participated in a cannibalistic feast where they consumed parts of the sacrificed child's body. They believed that doing so transferred the child's strength and bravery to them. The remains were then burned in the central bonfire, and the ashes were mixed with the warrior's blood to create a ritual ink. With that ink, they painted symbols of Odin on their own bodies before heading into battle. Warriors who took part in a barnblot were considered by other Vikings to be draugr, undead. They believed that killing one's own child destroyed the father's human soul, transforming him into a supernatural creature thirsting for blood. And it worked. Armies confronting warriors who had participated in a barnblot reported facing demons in human form. Battle-hardened soldiers, veterans of dozens of fights, simply fled when they saw symbols painted with blood and ashes of children on enemy bodies. But that extreme barbarity also sealed the fate of the Vikings themselves. When Christianity began spreading across Europe, the reports of these rituals became psychological weapons of war. Entire kingdoms united specifically to exterminate the child eaters of the north. It was no longer territorial war. It was a crusade to eliminate evil from the face of the earth. The irony is that the very rituals that gave Vikings supernatural power became the cause of the ruin of Viking culture. When you turn your children into offerings to the gods, eventually no one remains to carry on the lineage. The last documented executions of barnblot occurred at the end of the 11th century, during the failed invasions of England. Desperate berserkers sacrificed hundreds of children in a bid to obtain Odin's blessing for an impossible victory. The victory never came. What remained were only accounts in medieval manuscripts, scattered archaeological evidence across Scandinavia, and the memory that humans are capable of horrors that defy all moral logic. The Vikings did not disappear because they were conquered by superior enemies. They vanished because their own culture consumed them from within. When you transform paternal love into fuel for violence, when you pervert the most basic instinct to protect one's family, you are not creating superior warriors. You are creating monsters who inevitably destroy themselves. And that is the truth about what the Vikings did before dying in battle. A truth so disturbing that history itself chose to bury it in forgotten manuscripts, hoping time would erase forever the memory of what happens when an entire civilization chooses to embrace absolute evil.